Hey everyone, I am Julia Heason, Director of Growth Marketing at Research Solutions, and I couldn't be more excited to welcome you to today's webinar. We're about to dive into what's arguably the hottest topic in academia right now, the integration and ethical use of AI tools in research and education. With research output growing exponentially and AI technologies evolving at lightning speed, we're all facing both incredible opportunities and complex challenges at the same time. And I have to tell you, I've been especially looking forward to this webinar today. And that's because we have two librarians joining us who went above and beyond in their approach to implementing AI at their university. Not only did they document the entire journey, but they've published their research and findings, giving us insights into what works and what doesn't in real academic settings. When we discovered their published study, we knew that we had to bring their expertise to you because their practical and evidence-based approach is exactly what we think the academic community needs right now. Before I actually introduce our panelists today, let me dive into the agenda and tell you what we're here to talk about. So after the introduction of the panelists today, we will dive into understanding the AI academic landscape, including some of the challenges that we see modern research is facing, as well as universities, customers. And then we'll dive into that study that I just mentioned of Alexandra and Joshua. We'll talk about the librarian's new responsibilities regarding AI, as well as the faculty's new responsibilities, key AI tools and their applications, how we can promote ethical AI use in academia, and then always my favorite part of the webinar is the Q&A. So we'll have dedicated time to answer, hopefully all of your questions, as many as we can. We have a pretty large group of people here today. And regarding the Q&A section down below on Zoom, it says Q&A. So feel free to add your questions as soon as they come up. Just know that we have that dedicated time towards the end to answer as many as possible. Okay, so let me introduce the speakers today. So from the Vanderbilt University, we have Alex Carroll. He's the Associate Director of the Science and Engineering Library, and Joshua Borisks, Librarian for STEM Research. And these are the gentlemen behind the research paper that I just mentioned. Also, we have one more panelist who's having Zoom issues today. I hope he should be able to join any second. I'm sure we'll still be able to make that work. We've invited Sean Rive to join us. He's an assistant professor of psychology at Murray State University, and he's been actively incorporating AI and large language models into his own classroom, experiencing firsthand both the challenges and opportunities these tools present to faculty and students. So I hope we'll see his face on here very soon. We'll get started nevertheless, so thank you so much for joining. Okay, so let's discuss a few of the challenges that we see face modern research today. First of all is the exponential growth in research spread. So as you can kind of see on this graphic, just the pure amount of research that is getting published increases. So it's really hard to keep up with the amount of research, knowing what is actually helpful for us in the research community, in the academic community, and some of the other issues and challenges that we see. Right on the next slide. The amount of AI tools put out there, there's like so many, it's really hard to keep up, and a few of them put research integrity at risk. Information overload, as I mentioned, just with the pure amount of research that gets published, it's definitely hard to keep up. In certain instances, we have fragmented access, or there's certain paywalls that we hit. And then also the varying quality of output and the lack of reproducibility. Can we actually trust the research that we find? Okay, with that being said, before I hand it over to our panelists, I want to pull up a poll here. Just love to hear from all of you here today. Here it is. You should be able to see this. Which aspect of AI or large language models in academia concerns you the most? It's multi-select, so if you have several, feel free to just take a moment here to fill this out. Maybe it's the university reputation risks from undetected AI-generated research papers, faculty struggling to adapt assessment methods to an AI-enabled world, difficulty verifying originality of graduate thesis or dissertation works. Maybe it's something else, and feel free to use the chat and specify it there if you want to share something else. Okay, see the bar going up and down. Let's give folks just another second here. See something sent in the chat, which is ethics. Right now, AI policies are restrictive. Lack of emphasis on the, it's moving so quick. Legal impacts of using Gen AI tools. AI providing false information. Yeah, there's certainly many concerns here being added in the chat. Loss of writing skills by everyone. Yes, that's a good one. We hear quite a lot, especially from faculty. Awesome. Okay, let me end the poll and share the results with all of you so you can see this. Share results. Okay, so it looks like one of the largest or mostly selected concern was faculty struggling to adapt assessment methods to an AI-enabled world. Interesting, followed by difficulty verifying originality of graduate thesis dissertation works. And then the other ones are followed, and there's quite a lot here in chat. Interesting. Okay, well, thank you everyone so much for providing that information in the poll. And I'm actually very glad, Sean, to see your face that we were able to figure that out. I introduced you just like a second ago, but everyone, this is also Sean Rife on the webinar today. Now,
that sounds great.
Let me hand it over to Alex to kick things off from your point of view.
Hey, Julia, thank you for that. And thank you for inviting us here. And thank you everyone for joining us. So Josh and I are going to start by talking a little bit about some of the work that we mentioned that we were invited to talk about here. So before, though, I dive into, we can go ahead and advance to the next slide here. And so this is a little bit about, this is the paper we're going to be discussing today. And we've got a QR code to take you right to it. This is also published in the Journal of Academic Librarianship, and it was published open access. So we encourage you to take a look at this later at your leisure if you'd like. Before we talk about kind of the specific work that we did and the specific findings, though, I always like to kind of take folks back to kind of the origin story of this work a little bit. So we published this last spring. Based on work that we started doing in kind of the fall of 2023. But I think a little bit of context about where Josh and I were, kind of why we were interested in doing this work, I think could be helpful. So if you want to go back or go forward here to the next slide, one of the things I think that's really helpful to think about, right, is kind of the timeline of how these tools kind of dropped onto us here, right? So it feels like, the GPT tools kind of feel ubiquitous at this point, right? They feel like they're all around us. They're in the air we breathe, right? The water we're drinking, all that kind of stuff. But it is worth thinking about that I think for a lot of folks, this kind of fell out of nowhere in November 30th of 2022. And I think even with just a little bit of hindsight here, one of the things I think is really remarkable about kind of the origin story or the public launch of these tools is just how quickly they kind of resonated here. So if you look kind of in the past, and we kind of advance the next slide here, one of the things that I think is interesting is that almost immediately, within a couple days, we see the public press is picking these tools up and they're starting to explore them. Within a week, right, you have Sam Altman saying that ChatGPT has over 1 million users. And then within about 8 days of the public launch, we already have the first declaration that college level writing and reading are dead, right? And that it's all the way over. And so I think it's really helpful to kind of put these on a timeline here on the next slide. Josh and I often joke that this is kind of the fastest moral panic in human history, right? In that we go from the public launch on November 30th to college is dead on December 6th, right? And so certainly I think it was very easy kind of to get caught in the doom and gloom of this and to kind of get worried about what it was going to look like, what college level writing or what kind of academic research was going to look like going forward. And so that was kind of how Josh and I got interested in this, right? We kind of we played with GPT. It didn't really kind of jump off the page with us. But what really started to catch our attention was when we started to see tools that were really kind of built purposely to kind of engage more with technical writing, with academic research, right? So ones that we saw the first time we saw the site assistant, I can distinctly remember the tech demo, Joshua, you and I did for this, where we saw it developing these summaries in real time. I can distinctly remember the first times I saw someone drop a PDF into Notebook LM and have it identify, these are the most important papers cited in this. And when we started to see tools like this getting developed, this really kind of started to create a question for us, right? And the big question that we started to think about was that, we had built a really kind of robust instruction program at Vanderbilt, really based on teaching students how to translate natural language into structured search strings, right? How to think about the different critical elements of your search strategy, how to combine those together with operators. And we now kind of were looking at these tools and we were thinking, if we found these tools, it's a matter of time till our students do. So on the next slide, right, I think the real crux of this, right, is we just kind of realized that how we were teaching search was going to have to iterate, right? We were going to have to evolve because our approaches that we use, we think were important. We think there's value in field tag searching, and we think that there's use in having the precise control of searching in a library licensed ANI tool. But we knew that how we would teach this would have to change when students were able to use a natural language query and get directly interfacing with nature in New England Journal of Medicine. So I'm going to hand it over to Josh here to tell you a little bit about what kind of what work we actually did starting the fall of 2023.
Okay, so our initial idea was to take the courses in which we're already embedded and teaching a lot of research methods and how to find resources and how to read and write, etc., and sort of incorporate how AI tools might be used for those aspects of the work that students do for research. So we were already in a number of courses. You can see a lot of engineering, some chemistry here. And we essentially just started putting in a few slides talking about how AI can be used properly for research. And one of the things that we were surprised by, if you go to the next slide, is when we did a little assessment to see how many students are using AI tools like ChatGPT for research. What we had heard was that they're all using it constantly. It's writing all their essays. It's destroying their minds. It's a lot of negativity. But actually what we found is, at least in their responses here, they might be lying, but that they weren't actually using it for research as often as we thought. Some people here, some of the students said sometimes. We didn't get very often or often for their research writing or finding resources or really any aspect of the research process in general. So one of the things that we wanted to communicate here is that AI is not necessarily all bad. That's kind of what has been heard in the media up to this point. A lot of people were afraid. It's a new technology. There was a moral panic, as Alex said. But we wanted to discuss what are the limitations of this tool and how could you use it in research in a way that would make sense, that would allow you to still learn, communicate your ideas, but make the process easier. So we came up with this conceptual framework of the 5 I's, which essentially summarize some of the main limitations of AI tools, large language models like ChatGPT. Go ahead and advance. And so these are the 5 I's. We want to start communicating that they're not going to find everything that they need to if they just use a large language model to help them find research. So the first I is incomplete. A lot of the research that's available in a professional database is not available when you search with a large language model. That's because it takes a long time to train these. So it's going to be a year or more old when all the data is trained and allows you to search for things. Also, it doesn't have access to a lot of the proprietary information that libraries typically pay to get access to through professional databases, which is very important for doing any kind of engineering or scientific research. Also, the answers that they give you are inconsistent. If you type the same question 10 times, you're likely to get 10 different answers. And if you phrase the question in a slightly different way, you'll get a very different set of answers. And if it's a type of LLM that provides sources, it will give you a different set of sources. Also, these tools are incoherent. They often can't find the provenance of specific articles, or they'll even make up certain articles. We've all heard of hallucinations before. You can actually go to a website and see a ranking and hallucination rate for specific citations for every single large language model out there. And even the best of them have a 2 to 3% hallucination rate. So the next one is illogical. They can't think. They're not thinking at all. All that they're doing is predicting the next word with some probability that is likely to make you happy based on upvotes. So they're just looking at a huge data set that they're trained on. And when you type in a specific keyword like climate change, they'll go to climate change areas of the web or areas of research, and they'll try and pull context out from there and then give you the next word based on that context. It's not thinking, it's not reasoning. It can't do anything like that. Also, these tools are indulgent because of the upvote process. they'll tell you what you want to hear. If you ask the question in a certain way, it'll say, yeah, you're totally right. Or yeah, this is the range that you're looking for, even if it's not even possible to achieve what you wanted. And so you have to specifically tune the question that you're asking to get it to be more critical, which requires some prior knowledge. So with these limitations in mind, we still think that these tools can be used for research in a meaningful way. So this is not a prescription against using artificial intelligence. It's an acceptance of the fact that these will be used. They are useful for some things, but if you have knowledge of their limitations, you're more able to use them in a meaningful way for your research. So these 5 I's assume that students will, can, and should use AI tools. I use them every day. Many of the people I know here use them every day to do research and to help with research workflows. And the 5 I's encourage students to consider specific limitations while they're doing so that their ideas are at the forefront, and so that any issues that arise, they can realize this is just one of the limitations of the tool, and I should go somewhere else for the rest of the information I need. And the 5 I's suggest that using AI appropriately and selectively is a good idea, but you should not use it exclusively. Okay. And when we taught this, based on this sort of organizational principle, what we found is that students were a lot more likely to use it. They felt more confident knowing, okay, this is what it's good for, this is what it's bad for. And after we gave this lecture and asked the students to, again, rank how likely they are to use these tools, we found that it rose in a significant way in each of these classes. So some of the key takeaways from this, if you go to the next slide, are that students' prior experience using AI for research varies considerably. Many of them hadn't used it much at all. Some people had used it some of the time for random things. And it depends on the type of work they're doing or their interest or their in AI or computing. And students in general do want to understand how to use AI for research within ethical parameters. So we expected them all to be using it constantly and to just not even think about it, but in fact, they were actually thoughtful about it, and they wanted to know the limitations because they don't want to get in trouble, and they actually are here to learn. And the 5 I's offer an adaptable, resonant framework that introduces students to these limitations in a way that they can remember, and still be able to use these tools in a meaningful and quality way that will help improve their research rather than ruin their writing skills or ruin their searching skills. Okay. And so what we would recommend based on our experience and assessment of these students is essentially that you begin teaching the limitations of using AI in a way that is meaningful for research, but keep in mind that as an educator, you do not need to understand computer science to teach others how to use AI tools more effectively. We went through and understood the basics of how these tools work, but you don't have to understand the underlying code. You just have to understand the principles behind the development AI and the limitations. Also, AI information retrieval is fundamentally different than traditional information retrieval. The metaphor that we like to use is as a jazz band versus a chamber orchestra. So when you're doing a traditional search with your Boolean operators and your parentheses and your wildcards, etc., you'll get the same set of results every single time. It's very consistent. It's very systematic, just like a chamber orchestra with their music, which is heavily prescribed and everyone plays the same note every time. But a jazz band can essentially make things up. It can take notes that they think will work next and put them in a new place and improvise. And so that is what these AI tools are doing. And it makes them useful in many ways, but bad in many ways for certain tasks. Also, sorry, let me just get the last one. So you also want to develop relevant examples for the students, and this will involve understanding the context of how they might use AI and showing them, based on that context, the limitations in a way that makes actual sense to them. One of the examples we use is when, they had AI try to count the number of R's in strawberry, and we use that to explain how tokenization works and how it breaks up individual words into different tokens to get the context by creating vectors. And explaining that helped students understand the limitations and understand why it would get things wrong in certain cases. Okay. So that is those are the action items and takeaways from our experience teaching students. I just want to say that Alex and I have written a book that has a chapter on our experience writing AI and sort of the philosophy that we've developed in it, as well as many other things, how to teach generally in our experience, and why teaching STEM in a unique and important way and understanding is important for universities. So if you're interested in that, that is available here. You can get the QR code or Google Essentials of STEM Librarianship and you'll find it. Yeah, that's what we have for you. Thank you all. And now I'll pass it on to Sean Reif.
Thanks, Joshua. Thank you, Alexander. Really appreciate it. Loved your paper, loved the presentation. And I'm going to agree with a lot of the stuff you said, certainly, in fact, pretty much all of it. But coming at this from a slightly different angle. So I think Julia probably mentioned as I was having some technical issues getting in, but I'm one of the co-founders of SITE, as well as a of psychology at Murray State University in Kentucky. And so I kind of have, some insight from the perspective of someone who is creating these tools, but also using these tools and teaching my students how to use them. And so, speaking of, I really love this notion of the fastest moral panic was really just this question of, all right, how do faculty respond? How do I teach now that this tool exists? So there are some things that I think that we can actually point out and some insights I think we can bring. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. This is something that we've already covered. I always say this technology is too good not to use. It is interesting to note that before students are sort of acclimated to this technology and have really been taught about it, they are more reluctant to use it. In my own experience, whenever I teach, I'll just sort of ask informally, how many of you have used an AI tool, on a class project at some point? And, usually about half the class raises their hand. Again, I don't know how many of them are being entirely forthcoming or not, but I think it is a safe assumption that our students are going to be using these tools because they are as powerful as they are. And when I think about my job as a professor, part of my job is not just to instill students' abilities to think critically and to understand certain concepts or facts, but it's also to teach students how to be effective in graduate school, in the workforce, where they're going to be competing with people who are also using these tools. So I actually will teach students how to use the tools. And all of my students get a free account at with SITE, so they use SITE Assistant. And I will actually talk about a lot of those strengths and weaknesses that Joshua was talking about earlier. Here's the smart way to use this technology. And so, my rule is that in my classes, you can use AI tools, unless I tell you not to. That's the first caveat. And there are a couple of assignments I have where I do say, no AI tools. The second one is simply that I want you to tell me what tool you used. And I use that approach because the idea is that, in classes where, it's not a writing intensive class, or it's not, really, there's not a big information seeking component to it. What I'm trying to incentivize students to do is to, be forthcoming, but also, avoid those tools where they're not appropriate. And so what I've really done over the past few years is I've really reworked a lot of my out of class assignments, basic homework assignments, and really anything that I now give that's a writing assignment out of class, These are assignments that are personally relevant or interesting, with the idea being that students are just going to be more likely to want to complete those assignments. So I teach a senior seminar on psychology and current events, and my first assignment in there is it's anonymous. I say, tell me your most controversial opinion. Now, could you get, ChatGPT or Site Assistant to go in there and give you a controversial opinion? Sure. But most people have controversial opinions, maybe one or two, and they don't mind telling you, especially if it's anonymous, what that is. And so that's personally relevant. It's interesting. And then also the assignments that I now give are straightforward, such that prompt engineering and using an AI tool was probably actually more work than simply completing the assignment. And so those are sort of the main categories of short form writing assignments that I now give. I do have in-class writing that goes on, and those are particularly in the context of exams. But I also teach a Research Methods 2 class where students will write a literature review, they'll design a study, they'll collect data, they'll do the entire research process from start to finish. And we spend, I haven't officially flipped that classroom, but we will spend basically, probably about half the time in that class actually writing, actually searching, and I will show students how to use Site Assistant in a way that's effective. And I'll say, here's an example of a search that we did. A student will say, hey, I'm trying to find information on this particular theory, and I'll help them work through the prompting, work through the results, and I'll tell them things like you should be not only disclosing what tools you use, but also you should be going through and using that information that's provided by the A tool as a starting place. Use that as a reading list. Use that as a way of just overcoming the anxiety of sitting down and looking at a blank page in Microsoft Word. You can start with that output, but you shouldn't finish with it. And that is how these tools are used ethically and effectively. That is how you're going to get the most mileage out of these products, and really how you're going to go from just sort of scraping by because you're using the tool to avoid the work to getting an A in the class because you understand how to use this technology. And those are skills that students can hopefully leave my classroom with, go out into the world, and actually be more effective in a variety of ways because they understand the strengths and weaknesses of this technology in ways that a lot of other people who have simply been told don't use it in my classroom, which is on my campus, that's sort of, I think, the modal policy, in a ways that people who have been subjected to that really don't, because they don't understand the ins and outs of it. The last point that I'll make here is that it is possible that the sort of standard out of class long form writing assignment, the term paper, we may be ending the period where that is sort of been at its peak utility. And I think about this sometimes. Do I want to continue having students in that one research methods class? Do I want them to actually continue writing one big paper? Maybe that's not the most effective assessment tool that I could be doing. Maybe they should be giving presentations, and I should be asking them for a bibliography before the presentation, and I can then ask them about some of the papers that they read, right? That's a way that they can read those papers using, again, Site Assistant to help them understand concepts that are maybe a little bit beyond their understanding, and then they can reiterate that knowledge in person in front of me, and in front of their classmates, and maybe that's a more valuable experience in terms of assessing how well they understand the concepts. So I think there are a lot of really good alternatives that we could be exploring. Oral exams could be making a comeback in some instances, and I think we need to look at this as a set of opportunities, not just as a set of challenges. So yeah, that's my take on it. Julia, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, that was great. Thank you all. And I already see quite a lot of questions going on. We'll dive into them here in just a second. One thing I wanted to call out real quick is we have this free AI prompt handbook for academia. There's actually an ebook that Sean helped write, and it is specifically using Site Assistant, which is Site Assistant belongs to Research Solutions, the company behind this webinar today. And Sean is the co-founder of Site and Site Assistant. So yeah, if you want to learn more about it, I'm adding the link in the chat right now. You should also have all the links of the previously mentioned resources. I will also send an email later today with the recording and all the resources. So don't worry about that. Just wanted to provide some helpful information here. Okay, let's get started, the first question I would like to ask the three of you is, what was your first reaction when ChatGPT emerged, and how has your perspective evolved since then from your unique position as a librarian, or in the case of Sean, as a professor? Who wants to kick us off with this question?
I can go ahead. So I had mostly heard about these things on podcasts. A lot of people talking about how, as Alex was saying, they're gonna ruin the world or destroy us all or things like that. It was all very clickbaity sounding based on what I had heard before, but they were talking about general AI. So it was things like, if you ask AI to create paper clips but don't specify too much, it will turn all humans into paper clips. And so I came into it kind of with a negative view of how AI would work. I also was a little shocked that a tool like this came out so quickly. I expected it not to happen for another 5 or 10 years. I think a lot of people were shocked that it popped up and then it started writing, and it was a little scary. But then once you understand how these things work and that it's just trained on a huge data set, it's not really thinking, that then you can kind of understand the limitations a lot more. So I started out with a little trepidation, a little scared at first. Then I read and understood a little more and started practicing with them and using them, and I found them very useful for many things. And the large language models came out after a lot of the image generation tools, and those things were actually very silly in a lot of the same ways that large language models are very silly. They just make nonsense up. They pull things out of the air. If you ask for like, a horse flying through the sky with people in the background, it'll give you horse people. It does a lot of silly things. And so I tried to figure out how it might be useful actually, and what the students might actually think about using it for, rather than being too scared to introduce it into the courses, because it is useful for things that I use it for every day, like coding, brainstorming, rewording sentences, capturing little grammar mistakes, teaching you new concepts at your level, explaining things in a simple way. It's very useful for those things. So then I started trying to incorporate it into my work.
Amazing. That's so interesting. Thank you, Joshua. Alex, I see you wanting to jump in here.
Sure. I don't have a ton to add. I mean, most of my experiences kind of echo Josh's. I would say that, one of the things I think Josh and I were both kind of somewhat dismissive when we first saw these tools pop up. We work with computer scientists at Vanderbilt. That's one of the departments we work with. And so I think, he and I had both seen folks that were working in kind of the deep learning space and had seen demos of things like GPT-2 or things. And, those tools, when you saw them, looked a lot like, ELIZA, really, right? They looked closer to the old MIT 1950s next letter predictors than GPT-3, which really kind of felt like a paradigm shift. But even when GPT-3 first came out, as Josh said, I think we were thinking about them a lot in the context of those image generators where, you tell it, show me a pizza box, and it would create a piece of pizza on top of a box or whatever, rather than an actual box that would hold a pizza in it. And so I think, and also, we were kind of thinking that, well, these tools are great, but they've just been trained on the open web. So they're not going to give our user communities kind of the access to the actual kind of technical data, technical literature that they're going to need to. So I think kind of our initial response was that, we really thought that kind of our traditional tools, our traditional skills were going to be still really critical and important. And then the speed at which we started to see specialized tools that really would integrate with and utilize technical literature really forced us to kind of change our position and get more open to using them. And I think one of the most important things kind of I've embraced, and I think I've seen questions about this coming up, is recognizing that you really can't ever feel satisfied that you have a sense and that you have a good control or firm grasp over what these tools' capabilities are, what their limitations are. And it's always worth kind of exploring what's coming out. I think we've had some folks ask us about the reasoning models and how those have kind of changed our opinions on them. And I think the reasoning models are really interesting, right? And I think in a lot of ways they address some of the things that we kind of talked about earlier. But I think what's interesting is that, when you scratch below the surface, you still see some of the same limitations that we can see ahead of time. I saw a great example just yesterday, actually, where someone had asked a reasoning model to explore whether pop music has more featured artists now. The hypothesis is that, Spotify, you want to have a bunch of artists on the track so that the algorithm will recommend it to more people because they've listened to one of these 4 artists or whatever. So they asked the reasoning model, I think it was OpenAI's reasoning model. I can't remember, but I think it was OpenAI's new reasoning model. Is this the case, right? And the reasoning model gave them this great data breakdown of how many tracks in 2025 have featured artists versus 2020 versus 2015. And then you look at the actual underneath the hood of the reasoning, and the model tells you that it knows it needs to come up with plausible sounding percentages. So it's going to come up with plausible sounding, totally fake percentages, right? And so it's interesting that it can still sometimes do these same things, right? Where the chain of reasoning lets you look under the hood and see the incoherence happening in real time, which is helpful and interesting, but I think creates some of the same challenges we've talked about before about really getting folks to think through kind of when and how these tools can be, when that jazz band tendency can get you into trouble. And it really is when we get to kind of specific values, looking up specific numbers.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much, Alex. How about you, Sean? What was your first reaction to ChatGPT and how has that changed?
Yeah, I think it's been mostly consistent with what Joshua and Alexander were saying. I think I initially I'm very dismissive of things when I first hear about them. I'm a wait and see kind of guy. But the earliest conversation that actually I do remember, and I'll just relate a somewhat funny story, is I was talking with some of my friends, my fellow professors in our department. This was on Saturday. We were at the bar. We were just hanging out, and one of my friends was saying, "This is the end of the world. This is this is apocalyptic," which is not an unusual response. And then another friend of mine arrived, and we just said, "Yeah, we're talking about it was Chat GPT. We're talking about Chat GPT. Students using Chat GPT." And he was like, "Oh, I love that thing. I'm using it to help write exam questions." So I mean, that's the bimodal response that I think we usually get. And like so many things, the truth is somewhere in the middle. So yeah.
Yeah, that's I think a fun story, and I think we've all heard those concerns at some point, right? Okay, let me dive into a few of the questions here. How do you see AI evolving for academia going forward? Do you see designated large language models comprising strictly peer-reviewed journals, articles, and other high-quality research papers to serve as academia? And in your view, will such a model overcome the 5 Eyes challenges?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, right? I think there's always going to be a role for critical thinking, right? Even if you told me that I was using a language model that, was trained exclusively on peer-reviewed journals, which, there's not enough text in peer-reviewed journals. The training that you need to train these models is so many more magnitudes of size bigger than what all of peer-reviewed journals, like the entire corpus of it is not big enough. But even if that was a hypothetical, right, where you guaranteed me I was only going to draw from, you still have the issue that, the peer-reviewed journal as itself is not a perfect medium for disseminating accurate information, right? This is always one of the funny things that Joshua and I run into, where folks tell us that you can't use an LLM because sometimes they make things up, right? Or sometimes they get things incorrect or whatever. And I'm like, well, the Lancet published the Wakefield paper, right? That linked to the MMR. So the idea that, and you go to any conference like Charleston, right? And there's panels and sessions on the issues of scientific fraud and retractions and how do we manage all these kinds of things. And so the idea that, you can't use the LLM because sometimes you get things wrong, that would apply to every information source ever, right? And so I think no matter how perfect these tools become, there's always going to be a role for critical thinking, for horizontal reading, for putting a premise or a claim in dialogue with another source of information and looking for the tension between them and trying to figure out which side seems more plausible to you. There's always going to be room for the human to do their reasoning.
Yeah, so one thing that we're seeing now is a lot of larger publishers coming up with retrieval augmented generation tools and putting them in their databases. And frankly, what we've seen so far is that they're not particularly good. it's way better to just do a systematic search in the classic way to find what you need. They don't really offer solutions. Often they make interpretations incorrectly. The training isn't particularly good and the tool is not user-friendly so far. One of the things that we have seen is a lot of different groups, students, some PIs, some research groups, developing their own RAG models where they get some papers on their own and they take something like a ChatGPT algorithm and then create their own retrieval set of papers to answer very specific questions about some medical condition or some specific engineering task. And I think specialized, very specialized and tuned large language models like that are going to become more and more popular. One thing that I hope to see, which I haven't seen anywhere yet, is to somehow include metadata within these retrieval augmented generation tools or large language models in general, where you could go into a database and say, give me all the papers that have an impact factor over 5, and it would find them and put them all in front of you and then summarize them, something like that. Give me all the papers by X author, and it would do that. Like, I've never seen that. That would be far and away the most useful thing that any AI tool has been able to do so far, but for some reason it hasn't been developed. That's what I hope to see.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say I think one thing that I'll be very interested to see is the evolution of augmented model, the RAGs, sorry, going forward. Because I think, is one of the key limitations there is really access to the full text of papers, which is, something that is as much of a legal problem or a legal hurdle as it is a technological hurdle. So I think, my bet is we'll see a lot more sort of advancement from that approach rather than training specialized LLMs. But that's not my area necessarily, so I defer to others' expertise on that. But I'll also say that I think kind of some of the interesting use cases for this technology. I'll just give one example. I had a student who was starting a research project who was using this very specific methodology, and it was in an area that I knew a tiny bit about, but not enough to really understand all the terminology. I wouldn't know where to construct like a proper Boolean query in order to come up with all the papers that this student should read, because I just don't know the terminology. And so I was able to just ask the assistant. I was just like, here's this methodology. Has anyone ever done any studies like that? And it actually was able to come up with a reading list as a result. And from that, I was able to extract some key terminology, and I was able to tell a student, okay, here's how you need to go through and actually do some searches. Here's this key paper. Here's this literature. And so I think, again, that's playing to sort of a strength of that that sort of RAG approach.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that was a great question. There's so many questions. I'm really trying to keep up here. Let me read out the next one here. New AI tools seem to be coming out every day. I can barely get curious about one before I hear of another. Are there certain well-made supported AI that you think will be around for a long time? What would you recommend to students and faculty to use? Curious to hear from all three of you.
Cite is the best tool for research that I've seen so far. The RAG tools that are being developed thus far, they're going to get better and better, but so far they're not as good, nearly as good as Cite. I think that Perplexity AI is pretty good, and it gives you sources, and you can specify if you want it to do academic or just the whole web or like news sources. So that one's pretty robust. ChatGPT is going to be around. It's currently kind of the standard, apart from hearing that DeepSeek came out. So I think if you want research, if you want citations, if you want provenance, then we have Perplexity available in Cite. If you want just generalized questions on, like I want to learn Spanish, something like that, then you might use ChatGPT.
Thanks, Josh. How about you, Alex?
No, I don't have a ton to add there, right? I often kind of one of the biggest things we encourage folks to do, whether they are librarians or whether they are faculty or whether they're students or friends or whatever, is to just try the tools out and try them out for fun, try them out for work. I am always kind of surprised at how good these kinds of things are, right? Like I'm going to be probably taking a trip to Scotland at some point, and I was curious as to, I told it I'm an American, I'm going to be there for 4 nights. Where should I go that would be, both fun and memorable, but maybe one or two things off the beaten path. And it will build you, an itinerary, right? Where it say that here's 2 days in Edinburgh, here's 1 day out in the Fisher villages or whatever. And I remember asking my wife, who did a semester over there in Scotland, what do you think about this? And she's like, yeah, that's basically right. That's kind of what I would recommend too. And so I'm always kind of surprised at how, the kind of variety of use cases that you can use these things for.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Sean, how about you?
Yeah, no, my biases are well known here for obvious reasons. Yeah, no, but I use ChatGPT a lot when I'm writing code. It's really great for, just telling it, hey, I need this Postgres query that does this. So it's useful in that regard. But I'm very bullish on Site Assistant. But as Joshua mentioned, some of the other, Perplexity is a good product as well. Yeah, I can't say more without just being my own biases about this. So.
Fair enough. Yeah. I've seen this question a few times here as I read through the chat, asking what is different, like what makes Site Assistant different to the other LLMs. Sean, you want to speak to that? Maybe just like a sentence or two to not.
Yeah, so Site Assistant is a RAG, and the thing that really makes it different is the data. This is kind of to my point earlier, because Site has access to the full text of articles, actually the citation statements, so the text that surrounds a citation. And we get that data, from the places that a lot of other places get them from open access papers, from abstracts. But we also have indexing agreements with publishers who will send us closed access content. And so, in sort of thinking about the future of this technology and what we can do with RAGs, I feel like access to more of that closed access text is really what we're going to see a lot of mileage from, and it's one of the reasons why I think Site has a really unique value proposition there, because it does have that closed access information.
Thanks so much for providing that information, Sean. Okay, I see a statement here. It says, I truly believe that generative AI is the best thing to happen to the teaching of information literacy. What are your thoughts on this statement?
Yeah, I think we have been really delighted by it, right? So Joshua and I have taught workshops to colleagues on this, right? About thinking about how you can bring generative AI into your information literacy practice. Because one of the things that we found, right, we were as nervous, I think, as just about anybody else, right? Like we kind of, when we thought about something like Cite AI or Perplexity or whatever, and at first, right, this felt to us like we were dinosaurs. We were looking at the asteroid, right? This felt like a literal existential thing, right? That this was going to totally disrupt us. This was going to get us out of business. But really, what we found, right, is that what this has done is created a really meaningful context that is super relevant to students, that is in the news all the time. And it's also an imperfect technology. So for us, it's just really a perfect kind of hook to get students interested in thinking about critical thinking and thinking about where is this information being sourced from, right? Why does the AI think this is so, right? Should I be convinced by it? And it's really been fun, right? When you can get it to do weird things, and you can get it to do things like ask it for the tensile strength of a property, and it will give you one value. You ask it, where did it get the claim from? And it'll give you a different value, right? Why did that happen? Which of these values is correct? And then we can go over to something like Novel, like, the Elsevier handbook product, or we can go to the CRC, what chemists call the rubber handbook, and look up the published reference value, and it's different again, right? So which should we trust, right? Why should you trust it? It's really kind of been, for us, it's been a really, really great way to reinvigorate kind of what our information literacy practice. And I would just, one of the reasons we go teach librarians about this stuff and why we're talking about it today is that I want every other teaching librarian to have that experience, right? Of having students engaged and excited to learn about reference values, learning about engineering handbooks.
Thank you so much, Alex, for providing that information. How do you handle colleagues or administration that fights against AI? That's a really interesting one too. Have you experienced that?
So we've been very fortunate so far in that, at least in the classes that we've taught, the faculty we've worked with, they've been very open to the idea of including AI. Some administrators are in general against it or want to block it, but we have not had any problems. We found our way around that each time. So I actually teach a class on data analysis for chemical physics and biology program, and we worked with a professor here named Ray Blind, and I essentially said, I use AI when I'm coding all the time. I'm going to teach these students how to use AI while they're coding. It would be very silly not to. It makes your life 1,000 times easier. It's way better. Like it can find things for you and write it up for you. There's no possible way that they're ever going to get a job as a coder or a researcher and not use this constantly. And he was like, yep, that makes perfect sense. Go ahead. Absolutely. Teach them how to do it. And so we use GitHub Copilot. We use ChatGPT. And we incorporate it right into R and Python environments, and it makes everything seamless. Sometimes I'll ChatGPT some code right in front of them, and I'll teach them some of the principles based on these 5 eyes on how to code well using it. Like, for example, don't just type a whole paragraph saying everything that you want it to do step by step, because it'll screw things up, or it'll write code that you don't understand, or it'll write code in a weird way that a person wouldn't. So you have to write step by step what you want and think through it yourself. And thinking through how to code yourself and having it write it actually makes you learn how to code faster. So it just makes life much easier. And I think most people are on board with that, who are at least, the boots on the ground when it comes to teaching students.
I'm really happy to hear about that. Sean, how about you?
Yeah, so I mean, in my experience, uh, the administration at my institution is not, I wouldn't necessarily say hands off, but I think, we have in our culture, I think, a very important idea of academic freedom, and that is something that really redounds to the individual professor can choose how to teach their class in the manner that they see fit, within limits, of course, and I think that really does apply here. Really, the administration has given some guidelines on what to put in your syllabus, or if based on what kind of policy you have, and I think that's been helpful. But that's been provided for professors who want to prohibit the use of AI in their classes, and those who want to encourage it. The higher administration has been pretty agnostic, I think, in my experience. Really, where a lot of the pushback comes from has been from, frankly, a lot of the faculty. And I mean, not to point fingers, but definitely, and I can totally understand why. I mean, professors who have been teaching small sections of writing classes, in English departments, is where I hear a lot of the pushback, and I totally get it. That makes complete sense from that perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering that. A question I've seen come up a few times is, are there differences in the way this framework is applied for research in the social sciences or sociological or research studies compared to STEM? Not all at once. Just kidding.
I'd have to think about that a little bit. I mean, in I guess you have to be a little more suspicious, perhaps, when you're doing a social science research and incorporating a large language model, because there's not one number that's right or wrong. It's up to interpretation, and so you might get it goes to a certain part of the web that's maybe a little politically biased, and then it gives you that opinion. So you have to watch out for that. But I can't think of a big difference between how you would use this sort of framework for interpreting social science versus physical sciences. It's just maybe a little more a little more skepticism.
I guess one thing I would add to that Joshua said is that I think the incomplete aspect of kind of how we think about the Five Eyes certainly applies in the fact that if you're thinking about it from the humanities, right, there's a whole world of information that doesn't have a digital facsimile, right? And something that doesn't have a digital facsimile is not going to be included in the training data of a large language model, right? And so I think you can think about that there's actually a huge opportunity in terms of, using kind of print analog materials and putting them kind of in dialogue, or using an AI to kind of think about these tools in a brand new way. And Joshua, do you want to talk really quickly about one or two of the projects we've seen at Vanderbilt about using some of these tools for humanities research?
Yeah, the big one that I can think of is the Slave Society's digital archive, which is run by Jane Landers, who's a very famous history professor here. And essentially she had her graduate students and postdocs go to different countries in South America, places around Brazil, and find documentation on enslaved people from merchant ships and governments from all over the country. And they were sometimes burned, heavily decayed. It was impossible to read them, that the language was, is not written in the same way that it once was. And she had her students scan them and use AI to find and interpret the words in them to extract information about the enslaved people. And they were able to, find, from what I understand, thousands of people who were undocumented and get their histories and understand, their family lineage and things like that, that were otherwise would have been lost to time without the introduction of AI.
Use case. Thank you so much for coming up with that. Okay, we have 2 more minutes. One last question, and then I'll let you all go on time. What's one piece of advice you'd give to institutions just starting their AI integration journey based on your specific experience so far? Sean, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing, I'll keep it short, is just understand that all of these tools are not all created equal, and some of them are better for some tasks than for others. So, seek out the tool that is the appropriate tool for what you're trying to do, and also understand that this technology is something that will be in our future, whether we like it or not. So I encourage people to try to embrace it and try to understand how you can integrate it with your work rather than resisting it.
Thanks, Sean. That's great. That's great. Really helpful.
Yeah, use cases, kind of as Sean was thinking, right? Thinking about what you want the technology to do, what you're trying to accomplish, who you're working with, and thinking about what's the appropriate tool and is an AI the appropriate tool to use. Use cases are kind of king in terms of this technology in my experience.
Alex.
Yeah, and I would say start small. Just you already have instruction that you're doing, just introduce a slide or two at first, and then build slowly from there as you learn more and as people ask more questions.
Joshua, awesome. I love these tips to bring us home here today. Okay, so if we click one slide forward, thank you all so much for attending today's webinar. As I mentioned, I will be sending out the recording with the resources mentioned. I know we didn't get to answer all questions. I hope we answered as many as possible. Feel free to reach out. I also have the emails listed here if you want to get in touch with either of our panelists. Thank you so much, Joshua, Alexander, and Sean, for presenting today and sharing all of your experiences. Has been incredibly helpful.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.